Fabricamos talento. Fabricamos innovación. Y, cómo no, sostenibilidad. Fabricamos una nueva economía. Y un mundo nuevo, en 3D, por supuesto. Pero sobre todo, fabricamos futuro. Y es que fabricamos empleo para más de 137.000 trabajadores. Fabricamos oportunidades globales de negocio en un espacio de más de 10 millones de metros cuadrados. Y fabricamos servicios de vanguardia y ventajas competitivas para más de 175 empresas. Consorcio de la Zona Franca. Fabricamos oportunidades para tu futuro.
Welcome to D-Factory, the factory that develops talent, technology, innovation, and of course in the heart of Barcelona. After all, D-Factory is consolidating Barcelona as a European capital of development for Industry 4.0, for digitalization, for transformation, creating 1,500 direct jobs and 5,000 indirect jobs in the city, close to the metro, the harbour and the airport. And promoted by the Consorcio de la Zona Franca de Barcelona.
Now it's the time of changes. Now is the time to move on. This is the time for solutions. Feel the motion. BNEW is born. BNEW none of you. No one connected to you. BNEW none of you. BNEW will do it for you. This is the time for solutions. BNEW is for you.
Hola a todos de nuevo. Seguimos desde el plató BINVEST, desde D-Factory Barcelona, el principal polo de atracción de la industria 4.0 de Europa. Y, bien, BNEW es muchas cosas, pero es un evento personalizado, con las medidas higiénico-sanitarias adecuadas, aunque es verdad que ya estamos en este tercer año después de la pandemia y, por lo tanto, contamos con todos nuestros ponentes prácticamente en directo, creativo, sensitivo y también Green Day. Y en este aspecto, en el de la sostenibilidad, es donde vamos ahora a poner el acento, porque el conocimiento no se para. Una prueba de ello, solo a nivel anecdótico, es que este mes en toda España ya se registran las mismas matriculaciones de coches de motor de combustión que eléctricos o híbridos. Por lo tanto, la revolución verde ya no es en futuro, hablamos en presente. Este tercer panel se titula Invest in New Energies, Hydrogen, Solar and Biomass. Y por ello contamos otra vez con Courtney Finger, Editor-in-Chief Investment Monitor, y con dos ponentes de lujo que nos hablarán de estas inversiones a través de la sostenibilidad, porque a través de ella también se puede tener un negocio, un futuro empresarial, con dos ponentes que se sitúan sus experiencias desde Marruecos e Inglaterra y desde Alemania y Medio Oriente. Courtney, thank you so much, and thank you to listening the experts in Invest. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you all for tuning in and joining us in person for those of you that are here. So as we continue the BINVEST track of the program, we'll turn our attention to a sector that is in fact a major driver of foreign direct investment flows worldwide, and that is renewable energy. Now, renewable energy has been a growth sector for FDI for a number of years, but has taken on heightened importance due to geopolitical developments and, of course, the development of renewable and diversification of energy sources is a strategic priority for nearly all governments around the world. That opens up a lot of opportunities for special economic zones to be hubs of this activity, but of course there are technical, political, and other challenges that have to be confronted if we are to properly cultivate renewable sources. And so we have two experts on hand who can talk us through some of this. Now, they've promised not to get too technical. We will make this a little bit renewable energy for dummies, or renewable energy 101, just to talk us through, first, the opportunities, second, the challenges, and maybe some of the issues with technical implementation, policy, regulation, and so on. To do that, we have Karim Palmieri, who's a partner at Quadrian Global. He's worked on a number of renewable energy infrastructure projects across Middle East and Africa and elsewhere, and is now focused on working with and in special economic zones for delivery of these projects. We have Andreas Baumgartner, a managing director of STIR Strategy Impact Reputation, FCED. That is a mouthful. And when I ask Andreas to tell me what he does, he's an expert working at the nexus of business, politics, and war. Well, that's never boring. And in fact, renewable energy sits right in that nexus. But I'm going to pick on Karim first, if I may. Now, there is, of course, a lot of interest and a lot of strategic pushes to develop renewable energy, but we've not really seen wholesale adoption of it. What holds us back? Or where are the bottlenecks and constraints?
So I think if you take the sort of 101 approach, the easiest place to see FDIs is sort of large-scale renewable energy projects, so mostly solar, wind, offshore wind is now a new, it's not new, but kind of starting to sort of take the lead. And these are sort of large mega projects. I think traditionally, these have been delivered more into emerging markets, where I sort of where I work, as development plays, because they're sort of they align very well on the FDI strategy. There's also more space, as I'm sure we'll cover later. And at the moment, what's happening is there was a huge drive, and leading up to COVID, you sort of had a breakdown in supply chains. So today, if you ask most financiers and investors, the reason that the renewable energy or the implementation of renewable energy infrastructure is stunting is because there's delays in projects, there's delays in supply chain, and so consequently these projects are kind of, the costs are skyrocketing, and forcing us to sort of stick with the status quo, which is not so much renewable. So I think that's kind of been one of the major challenges. Also, I think to a certain extent, when you look at kind of the motivation of the building of renewable energy projects, the key part is to have sort of cleaner energy. We have a discussion about that, but also kind of the geopolitical implications and economic implications of having this, I guess, on-hand energy source. And I think given the sort of the global turmoil, including what was sort of brought about by COVID, there's been a kind of reluctance to sort of do direct investments for someone else's energy sector. So I think some of those remain challenging. In terms of kind of the leaders on the sort of 101 basis, I think solar is very much something to watch. And again, traditional wind, so onshore wind, has its place. But I think offshore wind is something to watch out for, because it's kind of leading as well, and still on site.
And if we think specifically of solar, where do you see the big opportunities?
Well, I think the discussion about solar and sort of large-scale renewables, again, is kind of the availability of resources. I think so. If you look at places where there's, sunshine usually helps. I'm personally, I mean, sort of, I've worked in Morocco in the past, and the development there has been, I think, sort of world-leading. Morocco originally started with the Noor project, which this was sort of 15 years ago. Huge investment, pioneering solar. And I think most recently, that's like kind of been followed up with sort of large commitments to solar in that region, because you get sort of the necessary sunshine, let's say, as well as we have the space to kind of do that. The question then becomes, how do you export that? Is it transmission lines? Is it production of other fuels, hydrogen, et cetera? And I think the opportunity there on a large FDI scale is to look at regions which have kind of the right mix to be sustainable on kind of all three aspects. And I think when you look at the other extreme, which is kind of micro solar, so rooftop solar, et cetera, you still have to take into account that these will only be plausible where there's the right resource. Also, solar has its kind of traditional challenge that it needs to have some sort of complementarity with, as an energy mix. You only get power out of solar during the day. So I think those are kind of the main factors on one side.
And what's the role for policymakers in all this? What helps incentivize it? And do incentives themselves, for example, make any difference?
Well, I think back to the first point, the solar was sort of leading towards a kind of subsidy-free model. And it looked like we were going to get there, especially in sort of some of the economies where it was easy to build. And again, breakdown of supply chains, delays in projects mean that actually governments have had to step in, DFIs have had to step in to kind of at least keep those projects afloat. And so the subsidy model is still sort of prevailing, but we're hoping that will kind of phase out. I see solar as probably the first place where that will happen. And I think, again, even as technology kind of advances, solar has its place for now. I don't think it's long-term sustainable as an industry. There's a whole solar industry that's going to lynch me for that, but it's okay.
I think we definitely want to come back to that.
Yeah,
That sounds a bit of a powder keg that we will revisit. But Andreas, if we're thinking still in the realm of policy, this is something that I'm sure you'll have a view on. How do you see the general regulatory environment for renewable energy, and what makes an impact?
I would actually like to pick up on what Karim said. We were really talking about two different areas. There's the large-scale projects, like those wind farms in Morocco that you just referred to, mega solar projects, for example, in the desert, in the United Arab Emirates, et cetera, et cetera. And then you have all those micro projects, many of which you're seeing here in Europe, rooftop solar, as we referred to. And really, I think we need to look at them. They belong together, but they're still separate in terms of incentives. In terms of the large-scale investment games, it's pretty much the same that you have for any large-scale FDI projects. It's, first of all, for the investors, the question on reliability, on predictability, on being able to count on regulatory frameworks, actually being stable for the lifetime of those projects. We're talking 20+ years on it. We're talking about very substantial investments. So it's that predictability, in a way, which is the most important one. Also, what we have to be aware of, and I think, Karim, you just hinted at it, with solar and wind, there are limitations to it. If you're looking at, for example, the power density of, let's say, solar or wind relative to coal and gas, well, they take up so much more space that basically, if we really intended with today's technologies to just supply our energy by using solar and wind, we would simply not have enough space on this earth to actually do it. So that's why, in a way, solar and wind are important. They are very, very justified at this stage. But I do not really see them yet as the long-term solution. And to come back then to the regulatory question, if that's the game we're playing, that has to be factored into any investment and development decisions. Second, of course, to come back on the regulatory side, solar, but even more so wind, do have impact on landscapes. They do have impact on, be it bird migration, et cetera, et cetera. So those are concerns that need to be taken seriously as well. And the third part on the regulatory side, of course, if you're producing, it's offtake. So what kind of offtake guarantees or models do you actually have in the mix to make those projects attractive? And that's usually what we're looking at when negotiating such large-scale projects.
What is the usefulness of special economic zones in sort of getting these projects off the ground? Does it make sense for these to be inside special economic zones?
I wouldn't say,
if we're thinking large-scale projects.
Well, not necessarily. It really depends on the total legal environment. But yes, there are a number of countries, especially some in the developing countries, where it makes a lot of sense to have a dedicated legal framework that is actually signaling trustworthiness to international investors so that they're willing to come there and invest. So from that perspective, it makes sense. Also, what we are seeing is special economic zones have come a long way. They basically started out as ports. They went into warehousing. They went into manufacturing, more complicated manufacturing, into services. What we are seeing right now in the economic zone space is an evolution from an industrial or services zone to cities. So to new cities coming up, cities of the 21st, 22nd century. And here, as we're building those new cities in zones, the zones have always been test beds, sandboxes for regulatory regimes. Why shouldn't they be sandboxes for new solutions on the energy side, on renewable energy side, micro-production of energy, probably some larger projects, but also, and we tend to forget that, the best way of ensuring sustainable energy is by not consuming energy. And so with all those new city projects that are coming up in special economic zones, there are some really fascinating discussions around how can we reduce the energy footprint of those cities so that we actually need to produce less energy.
Are there any good examples you could point to?
Well, I mean, one obvious example is Masdar in the United Arab Emirates, which is fully dedicated to sustainability, to renewable energy. And that's a very, very interesting example that's been around actually for quite a while now, and I still think has got a great future. If you're looking on in that space, some of the discussions around NEOM, right? Again, in Saudi Arabia, in a very energy hostile environment in a way. You know, there are some amazing considerations what could be done. And I'm currently involved actually in a future city development project where we are thinking from greenfield, what will the city of the future look like to really be a good energy environment? And actually there, the discussion is energy thought as physical energy, electricity, but also energy of people, vitality.
There's often a skepticism when countries that have, I guess, built their economies on traditional energy sources start to promote and develop renewable projects. Is that valid? And I'll ask both of you that question.
Do you want to go first?
Sure. Look, I mean, we are seeing, so the 2022 estimate of investment into renewable energy, according to the National Energy Agency, is about $1.4 trillion US dollars. So, you know, we're way beyond the question on should there be investment into renewable or not. There is investment into renewable, and it makes a lot of sense. I think the discussion we need to have now on the policy side is actually one step further. It's solar and wind is happening now. It's adding to the energy mix, and it's making it somewhat more renewable. The really interesting discussion is what will come thereafter. Will we be able to, you know, refine and develop solar and wind in a way that it really gets to a higher degree of energy efficiency? Or are we entering into a new age of nuclear? What's going to happen with hydrogen and so on? And the discussion that I'm seeing with policymakers is actually that the definition of sustainable energy is currently getting changed. So until about a year, 2 years ago, when you said sustainable energy, everybody said, yeah, clear, that's green energy, that's renewable. When you have sustainable energy discussions now, what we're speaking about is sustainable ecologically, as we had, but also sustainable economically, and I think that we're just seeing, reading the news, what's going on, and sustainable from a geopolitical perspective. And the really, really interesting debate happening at the moment is that ecological sustainability would, for example, argue for using space, for example, in the Sahara Desert, right? But that goes directly against geopolitical sustainability in terms of energy independence. And those trade-offs are the interesting discussions happening right at the moment.
Very much so. Karim, what would you add to that?
That was deep. I think I think if we dial it back to your original question as to sort of, I think, can some of the nations who have traditionally been able to sort of burn hydrocarbons at will in order to develop their economies and now just promoting sort of renewable energy, actually kind of sort of depriving, I guess is what you're saying, countries who are now trying to evolve in energy space and sort of limiting them just to renewable energy as opposed to go through that whole cycle. I think when you break that down, you're talking about sort of two aspects. On the one hand, there's a kind of almost a special economic zone solution, which is sort of what's the best practice on a regional, local, I mean, even household level. What should they do? And there's an argument for saying, well, what are best practices, renewables, et cetera? Or are you trying to talk about essentially a global solution? If you can rally everyone together and say, hey, by the way, this is kind of, if you can frame a regulatory framework for the transition of the world, fine. Otherwise, you are going to fall into a very interesting conversation about can we use our own oil to kind of get to a place where we can afford to build renewables, or is there a subsidy? I mean, we can get into a conversation about carbon credits or kind of, I guess, the development and kind of sharing of technologies. But that's not really 101, I don't think. So I guess the kind of the easy or the way to look at it would be while we work for a global solution, perhaps a global technology that makes all this happen. At the moment, it's very interesting to look at the technologies being built within something like special economic zones, which I believe in very strongly, sort of a thing.
Well, I won't let you off the hook of your skeptical comments about solar. Is there an over-focus on solar? And as a follow-on, how bullish are you on hydrogen as an option?
Thanks. So let's say solar at the moment is kind of paving the way for kind of the uses and kind of that's not the cleanest perhaps, because it's not actually kind of fully sustainable, because you only go one way. You produce the kind of the solar parks, and then there's no kind of it's not a closed cycle or circular economy, etc. Sort of when you talk about biogas or biomass and stuff. I think the question with that is what you do with the power once you have it. I mean, if we talk just quickly kind of on integrated zones, households, you're talking about heating as well as electricity. So those are kind of, and you need to be aware that actually heating something or heat power is different from electricity. If you're talking about solar, I think it's definitely has its place. I think it's probably going to take us a very long way. And as technologies evolve in that space, harnessing the power of, I guess, the sun, right? In order to provide electricity is going to be a mechanism that's going to be used. Whether that looks like today's solar, which is kind of huge parks, probably not. But there are advances in that technology where you can sort of look at, I mean, there are things in space as well. But I think if you're talking about the cycle again of using energy from the sun to produce power for the world, that's happening. It's just solar today needs to go through a couple of cycles before it's sustainable, I think. Is that edge enough?
Yes, and there's a question you'll like a bit better. How does the new energy paradigm impact economic relationship or even the geopolitical relationship between Europe and Africa? I know this is something that's a little closer to your heart, maybe.
Yeah, so I think, I mean, it's initially it's always been a sort of resource exchange. So if you imagine the flows of kind of traditional hydrocarbons, today LNG is a good transition resource, and you see how that kind of flows between Europe or let's say through Europe, through North Africa into Europe, even the Middle East, and the position that plays, it still kind of holds power with the developing countries. I think as that resource changes, I mean, Morocco is a very good example in the sense that we've hugely transitioned into renewable energy, and so now in a position to actually say as part of the energy mix, we're not just dependent on the ability to kind of pull resources and create energy, but actually produce energy ourselves and then eventually export. Now, if you look at kind of some of the initiatives in place, I mean, some very interesting projects are happening where it's sort of huge solar parks in the kind of southern parts of Morocco, which link all the way through into Europe and even into the UK. So now you're talking about a huge kind of different dynamic independence. Another thing of focus, and we've touched on it part, is actually the creation of hydrogen. So if you're able to produce on the ground hydrogen from sort of, let's say, from solar, then you can export that. Now, hydrogen itself is kind of, I know it's topic of the day, but does have its limitations. Again, you can use it for sort of manufacturing, heavy industry, et cetera, but it's not useful if you're looking at sort of heating households, for example. So you still have that gap. And then that sort of paves the way or leads the way for new technologies, which are very interesting, actually. I think Boris Johnson mentioned better kettles at some point. So
a strategic priority for the UK.
Yeah, it actually has its, there is a fun conversation to be had about that.
There is. Andreas, I want to get your thoughts on hydrogen as well and the potential, and where does that fit into our matrix here?
I think, I mean, as Karim already mentioned, and I would like to unpack that, it's hydrogen's transportable, and that's making it very interesting. But once again, my perspective and what I hear in discussions at the moment is, at the moment, we're talking solar, wind, to a certain extent biomass, and that's disputed at the moment. And then kind of there's hydrogen on the horizon. And all of that is part of the mix to make us less dependent on hydrocarbons from an ecological, economic, and geopolitical perspective. The question, I'm afraid, that we cannot avoid, right? And that we need to have is, what is on the horizon beyond all those four that I have just mentioned? And in part, that's a debate, for example, around nuclear. Now, I've grown up in Austria, which is strictly anti-nuclear, and I've been brought up with the strong conviction that, you know, this is as bad as it gets. And it is highly risky in the current generation. But at the same time, if you look around, I was recently at a meeting where they talk about, for example, dual liquid reactors that are pretty runaway safe. So there are all those things on the horizon that I think, as Europe, we should really invest into that research on daring to think, you know, what can we really do? How can we really get ahead of this curve rather than just, you know, running behind what others are doing? And that's, again, and I'm seconding you, actually, even though we're in hot water here, I'm seconding you, Karim. I'm doubtful that wind and solar is really the long-term solution. I'm doubtful of it because of the land it consumes. I'm also doubtful of it because of the overall ecological footprint some of those projects have. Yes, there are at the moment some large-scale wind parks, for example, in Africa, and please don't ask me to give specific names here. They are officially green energy, but if you look at it, new roads had to be built into areas that are actually, they were pretty well protected until then, right? You're transporting materials there to just build the windmills, etc. So don't get me wrong, I'm not against wind. I'm not against solar, but we need to think beyond.
Well, Karim, do you want to catch this hot potato that he lobbed at you about the role of nuclear?
Yeah. So I think just even before we embark on that, there is a slew of other sustainable, renewable energy, even energy sources that are happening that actually will kind of help, I say complement, I guess, solar, wind, and what you generally see. And I think the other piece that while all this is happening is kind of the developments on the energy efficiency on the consumption side, right? So you can imagine anything from, of course, the production of hydrogen as a fuel, as well as kind of how do you limit consumption of households, how do you improve manufacturing or heavy manufacturing, what are the energy sources that they need, can they have their own energy sources, etc. But yes, I mean, ultimately there is a conversation, or there's a conversation being had around nuclear. Now, and it can be, I think it's advancing. So even in the UK, I think there's some pretty strong initiatives, and it is evolving. And I guess the appeal is very strong, right? I mean, it has its kind of fallbacks, but again, advances in nuclear could be a very interesting answer for us. How to make that palatable for the world, what does that look like in terms of investment? Again, it's okay to do solar power, it's okay to do wind. I mean, natural resources such as hydro, biomass, etc. But when you're talking about capital investment for nuclear power plants, it's kind of, it sits in its own world. For the moment, yes. But as that reduces and you sort of say, you know what, the stability of having something that can provide electricity and heat on a continuous basis on a relatively small kind of land footprint, it's appealing if you can make it safe.
If I may pick up right on that, because Karim, what you mentioned is at the very beginning of your statement, you talked about energy conservation. And what I'm noticing in a lot of those panels, we're always talking about additional sources of energy. While there are very few panels in a way where the discussion is around how do we save energy? How do we make sure we use the existing energy in a more efficient way? And I strongly believe that the European and the global energy debate needs to shift in a certain way from just discussing how do we produce energy in a renewable and more sustainable way, towards this discussion of how do we use the existing energy in the best way possible so that optimally we're in a position that we do not even need to produce as much energy, because any energy production comes at a cost. However, it might be a higher cost, it might be a lower cost, but there's always cost, there's always a footprint. Energy that we are not consuming is actually the greenest energy, if you like.
Well, in that space of consumption and efficiency, where is the regulatory environment and all of that, and how much should be enforced as opposed to incentivized?
Well, I'm always a strong believer in incentives rather than enforce, because regulatory force only leads to people becoming creative on finding ways around. So in a way, we need to get towards building an environment where it's the smart thing, not just the reasonable thing, but the smart thing, also financially, to do. And that's where, for example, the whole discussion around insulation of houses becomes a super important topic. There are new technologies that just increase the insulation factors massively. And then you have to raise the question, if you're a government with limited resources, do you support the construction of, for example, another power plant? Even if it is by a private enterprise, usually there is public sector involvement. Or do you use that money to actually support insulation, just as an example? And that's, I think, the discussions we're going towards. And I could very well see how that's also a more palatable discussion within the European context in particular. Because, I mean, whatever you're doing, if you want to build a hydro power plant, if you want to build solar, if you want to build a large-scale wind farm, there is resistance. There is a limit to that as well.
Yeah, well, it's all these trade-offs and balances that have to be struck between competing priorities in a way, as well as resources. What are we missing here in this discussion, Karim? Are there other challenges or opportunities that we should be talking about?
I think there's one concept that actually sits at kind of the heart of development of renewables, is intermittency. So I think that's an important topic to kind of touch on. So I guess when you're looking at kind of the production of renewables and you say, okay, fine, solar, you have energy during the day, wind might be kind of more constant, but you always have that sort of intermittency. And the game, as it were, is to kind of match energy production alongside energy consumption, right? So both sides, if you imagine like sort of ideally, you'd be kind of using more of your energy. So this is how energy storage comes into the game. You sort of say, well, look, I don't need that much energy during the day, and so I'm going to flatten that. So on the production side, when you talk at solar, it's sort of very much kind of at flux, predictable, or relatively predictable. And if you talk about something sort of, let's just go to the extreme and you're using nuclear, you can't really turn a nuclear power plant off. That just doesn't happen, right? And the cost of doing that is actually demonstrated by some of the Austrian initiatives, which others. So I think if you want to have kind of like, let's say, pure nuclear production, you have to figure out how you're going to kind of make energy consumption at that stage. So how do you flatten energy consumption? And I think when you look at that on both sides, that's where you'll find opportunities. So you see, well, look, there's an increase in kind of intermittency in the world, so volatility, and then what are the kind of technologies on the other side that allow you to kind of mitigate that. So if we see a lot of intermittency, I'm going to go for sort of batteries, storage. I mean, there's a lot of initiatives in kind of the processing space. So energy processing originally used to be sort of kind of energy intensive. Now some companies are using kind of the ability to turn processes on and off as part of kind of mitigating kind of or draining excess energy. So on storage, you kind of build that and you sell that on the spot. And I think initiatives like that with sort of new technologies really do help kind of, and I think that's ultimately going to be the solution, right? Is you sort of match the curves and then begin to drop that as much as possible. And then that's sort of where we're heading, hopefully.
Okay.
Yeah.
Same question to you, Andreas.
I think we have spoken a lot about the kind of geopolitics of energy. We've spoken about those large-scale projects like your friends in Morocco, where I understand it's already about 40% of installed energy capacity is renewable, which is remarkable. What we haven't really touched upon, even though you referred to it in your introduction, is the kind of micro-solutions. So there is an ongoing debate on whether it actually makes sense to encourage individuals to put solar panels on their houses' roofs and those kind of things. And the perspective on that, very much coming from a development perspective and political perspective, is this might not solve our energy needs on the industrial scale. That's where we need to have this discussion we've just had. But it's those kind of micro solutions that are extremely important to get the awareness and the buy-in of the population. So it might actually not be the cheapest in strict economic terms, but it's those kind of projects that make sure that the people around the world are actually getting aware of the topic and are coming along, and everybody trying to do his or her thing in this space.
Okay, if we're looking into the future, we've got 5 minutes or so before we begin to wrap up. What will our discussions be in the next year or two? What should we be watching out for?
I'm afraid our discussions in the next year or two will still be very much around energy security, driven by geopolitical factors. I would love to be proven wrong when we're sitting here in a year's time. I hope that the discussion around energy security will not push back all the discussions that we're having about renewable. If you look at the discussions already happening, coal and gas are, well, they are back, especially coal.
Yeah, and well, that's a point. Can we solve that crunch where there's the urgent need and wish to, reduce reliance on, Russian oil and gas, for example. But if renewables aren't there yet, can we solve, jumping off one cliff before that the next cliff is there? How do we solve that?
I think if we solve that, we'd win quite a few prizes, Courtney. But that is exactly what we referred to earlier. We said, when you're talking about sustainable energy, it's economic, political, and ecological. And I'm afraid what we're going to see over the next month is that the ecological components may take a bit of a backseat. At the same time, there's an internal optimist in myself. Crisis typically triggers innovation. And if this forced crisis, which doesn't allow us to just lean back and say, oh, it's all good, we're fine anyway. If that crisis forces us to push out new innovations, take them from the universities, from the think tanks, into actual exploration and innovation, then I think there could actually be a blessing in disguise. In a very good disguise, though.
Do you share the optimism? And what do you think we'll be talking about if we have a similar panel in a year or two?
I think if we give ourselves probably 5 years, it's probably nicer. I hope I'll still be on a panel by then. I think there's a lot of change that you see on kind of the large-scale projects. So if you see a development in solar or wind or the direction of that on a kind of industrial level, that's at one particular level, and we can talk about that, and it tends to be kind of not as visible. I think what I'd be much more interested to see, and perhaps we can kind of, this is a slightly different panel, is what happens on a kind of, on a very much kind of household regional, a bit sort of local, regional level. I mean, the change and the potential for change there, because as you said, by the time the next kind of power source arrives, how much change can I make in the way that I use my household, the way that like mobility will affect us? I mean, there's talk of kind of using electric cars as sort of in-house batteries so you can sort of mitigate your prices. And then new technologies that sort of are happening every day. So to kind of sort of piggyback on your point, and it tends to be a bit of a cliche, but the innovation in that space, and not only just on the energy consumption, but kind of when you massively reduce supply chains, right? If I want to be autonomous, I want to be able to use this in my household or within kind of my my purview, integrated zones, etc. Those efforts, both from kind of governments, private sectors, I mean, innovations in all spaces, I think that's what, it's a discussion that'll be really fun and have evolved.
Yeah.
Well, for me anyway, that's...
So yes, we tend to get carried away with the macro because that's big and sexy and exciting, but the micro is really where it's at. It's what you've both argued.
It takes both.
Yeah.
Really does.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. I wish we could talk more. Thank you for your candor and sharing your insights and expertise. Thank you for our audience for tuning in, and join us more for further sessions as we continue on with the BINVEST track.
Thank you very much. The green revolution is a fact now, and it's linked to success. Thank you very much for these thoughts. Thank you, Courtney. It's a pleasure to listen to experts with such experience. Bien, en este panel hemos hablado de una cosa que, por ejemplo, Andreas decía, ¿no?, de entrada, que el concepto de sostenibilidad ya parte de la base que también tenemos que reformularlo. ¿Y hacia dónde van estas nuevas energías sostenibles, teniendo en cuenta que ahora entra un segundo factor, no solo el ecológico, sino también el económico? Pues este tema es el que profundizaremos con expertos y con puntos que ahora mismo del planeta ya están aplicando esta sostenibilidad en sus inversiones para hacer una revolución verde. Nosotros hacemos una breve pausa desde el canal Invest, desde este D-Factory Barcelona, y volvemos con el cuarto panel ya del día para el BNEW. Muchas gracias.
Fabricamos talento, fabricamos innovación y, cómo no, sostenibilidad. Fabricamos una nueva economía y un mundo nuevo, en 3D, por supuesto. Pero sobre todo, fabricamos futuro. Y es que fabricamos empleo para más de 137.000 trabajadores. Fabricamos oportunidades globales de negocio en un espacio de más de 10 millones de metros cuadrados. Y fabricamos servicios de vanguardia y ventajas competitivas para más de 175 empresas. Consorcio de la Zona Franca. Fabricamos oportunidades para tu futuro.
Welcome to D-Factory, the factory that develops talent, technology, innovation, and of course in the heart of Barcelona. After all, D-Factory is consolidating Barcelona as a European capital of development for Industry 4.0, for digitalization, for transformation, creating 1,500 direct jobs and 5,000 indirect jobs in the city, close to the metro, the harbour and the airport. And promoted by the Consorcio de la Zona Franca de Barcelona.